Hello and welcome to yet another virtual event with Tattered Cover. Tonight, we are in partnership with Water Education Colorado, who is bringing you an amazing event. I'll introduce them in just a second. I want to go over a few things. First, if you need or want closed captioning, there is a black bar at the bottom of your YouTube screen, and there's a button that says CC. That'll be closed captioning for anyone who wants or needs it. If you have any questions for tonight's guest, please put them in the YouTube chat. We will get them to the author and moderator for you. Go ahead and ask as many questions as you want. We can't get to them all, but we will get to as many as possible. There's also a link to buy the water knife from tattercover.com. Please support independent bookstores, but we appreciate you coming out for this amazing event again with Water Education Colorado. You're not here for me, so I'm going to pass it off to Jayla Poppleton, the Executive Director of Water Education Colorado, who has been amazing and put this amazing event together and brought Tattered Cover in. So thank you, Jayla. Please walk on into the virtual event room.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. And by no means does all the credit go to me. Thank you so much to Tattered Cover for hosting this event tonight, and to all of you for coming out to hear from our featured author and our moderator for this evening's program. Just a quick bit of information about our organization. Water Education Colorado has been working actively in Colorado since 2002, so for the past 20 years, through news, information, education, and leadership programs to ensure Coloradans are informed on water issues and equip them to make informed decisions for a sustainable future for Colorado water. And among other things, this year we are spearheading a public awareness campaign called Water 22, short for 2022. And we're highlighting milestones in water, including the 100th anniversary of the Colorado River Compact, which ties into the book that we're going to be discussing tonight. And we also are highlighting risks to water sustainability and encouraging Coloradans to
Hi, everyone. I think Jayla's screen froze. Paolo and Brad, are you still there?
Yes, here I am, Adam.
Technology happens. So we are going to continue rocking and rolling. Brad, I did not prepare an introduction because I was going to expect Jayla to do it. But Brad Udall, if you don't mind kind of taking over and introducing yourself and then introducing tonight's amazing guest.
Sure, Adam. So my name's Brad Udall. I'm a senior water and climate research scientist and scholar, believe it or not, at Colorado State University's Colorado Water Center. And I have to say, my wife kids me about that title, and that she says I work on three things. I work on water and climate, and I'm really senior. So I work on how climate change is going to impact the Colorado River system. And it's my pleasure tonight to be here with our author, Paolo Bacigalupi, right, Paolo?
Yep, that's it. Yep.
So, Paolo, let me just say, I consider myself the skunk in the room. I often get to give a really distasteful message. I've given hundreds of talks on climate change. And when Jayla asked me to do this, I consider you a fellow skunk. So I don't mean that disrespectful, but it was a delight to be able to join you on this. And to all of those who don't know Paolo, he is a very accomplished author. He lives here in Colorado. He grew up on the West Slope, lives in Paona with his wife and son. His debut novel was in 2009 called The Wind-Up Girl. And he's written a number of books for middle grade students, teens, young adults, including a trilogy called Shipbreaker. His books have won a number of awards, including the Hugo Award, Nebula Locus. It was a National Book Award finalist. Many of these books are set in the future, involve difficult questions about genetic engineering, climate change, income inequality, water, and other critical themes. In an interview I saw, he said he likes to write to young adults often because their thinking isn't nearly as set in their ways as for those of us oldsters. He's an Oberlin graduate. He studied Chinese. He lived and worked in China, and you'll see that theme in The Water Knife. The Water Knife was published 7 years ago in May of 2015, and I would call it a near future dystopian mystery thriller. And I want to read you two little blurbs, one from NPR, and they called it a noirish cinematic thriller set in the midst of a water war between Las Vegas and Phoenix. Think Chinatown meets Mad Max. And Kim Stanley Robinson, author of Ministry for the Future, said an intense thriller and a deeply insightful vision of the coming century laid out in all its pain and glory. It's a water knife indeed, right to the heart. So with that introduction, Paolo and I have put together about 6 or 7 questions we're going to wander through for the next 35 minutes, and then we'll get to your audience questions. And so the first question I wanted to do is to let Paolo set the stage here for those who haven't read the book or who need a refresher. And what I want him to do is to describe the opening chapter and the general thrust of the book. And while he's at it, some of the terms that he uses and the technology, including what's a water knife and what's an arcology and what's a clear sack. So with that, Paolo, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Brad. I'm glad to be here, glad to be doing this. It's interesting to sort of be coming back to this book, 7 years later and have it feel more relevant than when I wrote it. So in the opening scene of The Water Knife, the overall story that I decided to focus on was a story of water conflict between Las Vegas and Phoenix, and as the sort of a microcosm of all of the states that are sort of dependent on the Colorado River system, and that as a microcosm of the larger questions of climate and stability and prosperity that we all sort of depend on for a stable climate. And so I was interested in sort of setting up a world where you have two different cities, one of which has planned for a future and one of which hasn't. And so Las Vegas, in this opening scene, you get to see Las Vegas. And Las Vegas has planned. Las Vegas has done everything that it possibly can to continue to prosper, but also to preserve every drop of water that it has. And so they've started, not only have they started getting rid of all of their suburban developments, but they've started sort of collecting humanity into larger and larger sort of vertical developments, which are fully integrated with their water system, so that the living spaces are also vertical farms, are also pools and water treatment systems and everything. They're reusing their water again and again and again and again in the most efficient possible ways to grow food, to maintain their sort of human health, to generate an economy. All of those things are all sort of like done as efficiently as possible. And so all of that is going on inside these places called arcologies. It's a combination of a developed space that's also got ecological functions. And that's kind of something I was really interested in. And I mean, the other thing about the arcologies, though, is that the arcologies are places where prosperous people live. And they're the water solution and water recycling set of water recycling solutions for prosperous people. At the other end of the spectrum, I invented something called clear sacks, which are these plastic bags for water recycling that you can pee into, and then you can squeeze them and the water is filtered back again. And these are designed for the poor. And so one of the things I'm really fascinated about is how marketplaces address environmental problems. And what you oftentimes see is that a marketplace will respond to human need. Oh, we need to recycle water. The way that it will do it, though, is that it won't necessarily look back to the root cause and try to solve the root problem. It'll try to find a profitable solution that's more immediate in order to sort of satisfy the immediate urge or desire of a customer, but not necessarily solve the overall problem. And so the arcologies are for wealthy people. You can buy into an arcology. You can have a wonderful home, wonderful apartment. You can have hanging gardens, all of this kind of stuff. And the people who can't afford to buy into an arcology are out on the streets peeing into bags and squeezing those. And then those bags are eventually there, of course, not, they're only usable a certain number of times before they clog. So then they get thrown away. So then they're blowing around on the landscape and getting tangled up in the cactus and everything else. And that strikes me as being very much like what we do when we do market-based solutions to broad-based environmental problems. So that, it's interesting you sort of focused in on that, Brad. It's like, yeah, here are clear sacks, here are arcologies. This is the world that we live in. Anyway, the opening scene of The Water Knife focuses on a character named Angel Velasquez, and he's a water knife. And so what he does is he cuts water for Las Vegas. And Las Vegas, not only do they have these wonderful arcologies, they also have kind of secret agents or 007s of water that they send out to make sure that nobody else can steal their water, or in some cases to steal water for them. And so Angel goes out and he gives people offers on their water rights that they can't refuse, or he goes and blows up somebody else's water treatment plant, and so that they can't pump out of the river, but Las Vegas can. And that's in fact the first scene of the story is Angel going on a mission to blow up a water treatment plant to take advantage of a sort of a legal loophole to shut down the ability of another city to pump water and make sure that Las Vegas continues to have enough. So yeah, I don't know. I was aiming to try to create a sort of a thriller story that also had all these environmental layers and that sort of would look at the big picture of climate change. And I guess that's at least a simple summary. I don't know if I'm answering the question well.
No, that's cool. That's exactly what I wanted you to cover. So where was the genesis of this idea? How did you come up with it?
Well, I mean, the really, the ancient roots of this story came from working for an environmental publication called High Country News that covers the Western United States. And this was back in the early 2000s. And we as a newspaper were just starting to cover climate change. And I was the online editor there. And we as a newspaper were starting to cover climate change. We were covering a lot of stuff about drought in the Colorado River. And you were just seeing a lot of sort of like news stories kind of coming in, and you were starting to see a lot of research being done by different journalists. And it was all fairly troubling. And so I wrote a short story called The Tamarisk Hunter back in like 2003, I think. And it was the first sort of attempt to sort of poke at the idea of, climate change and how it might impact, a specific region. But the actual impetus to write The Water Knife, when I wrote The Tamarisk Hunter, I actually felt like I'd actually sort of answered the question that I'd been trying to puzzle through in my mind, and I set it aside. And then oddly, I didn't want to do any more climate change reporting or writing. And but then I was down in Texas in about 2011, and there was a huge drought happening down there. And I was visiting a friend, and the drought was so intense that, Texas was having rolling brownouts because it was like a whole complicated sort of sequence of problems that they were experiencing all at once. And so they were having rolling brownouts because their reservoirs were too low. So they didn't have enough hydraulic head in the reservoirs in order to turn the turbines. So suddenly at a moment when they were having record numbers of 100-degree days, and people were using their AC all the time, suddenly they didn't have enough electricity in the grid to like actually support that amount of demand. And so you're seeing rolling brownouts, you're seeing blackouts, things like that. You were seeing farmers having to put down their cattle because the land couldn't support them. There were a few towns that were actually having to truck in water. There were, I'm trying to remember, it was just like this whole panoply of just kind of horrifying problems. And one of the things that really struck me about all of those things was that a lot of what we were seeing really did seem to fit what climate predictions sort of predicted for Texas in the future. So there was a part of you that could kind of look at it and be like, okay, so instead of thinking of this as a drought, what if I think about this as time travel? What if I think about myself as this is the moment when I've leapt into the future? This is what the climate model predicts as a general future. what's it look like? And it was frightening because there were so many systems that were interdependent and so many systems that were clearly pretty brittle. And that was pretty profound to me. But the thing beyond that was interesting was that at the same time that all of that drought was happening, Rick Perry, the governor of Texas at the time, was going around and encouraging everybody to pray for rain. And that was the moment really where I decided, I thought, oh, maybe I need to come back and address this climate change question, because it wasn't necessarily just about climate change. It's about whether or not you deal with this problem in a rationalistic way or in a superstitious way. And that to me was something that was important. It's like, oh, we have this problem. We have scientists who are telling us some really concrete things. We could make plans, or we can engage in magical thinking. And so that was the genesis for like starting to think, okay, I'm going to come back to this topic. I want to address it again. And I specifically want to sort of poke at these ideas of how do you engage with, reality in a rational and forward-thinking way, and how do you deal with a large, abstract, complex problem? And, do we do that, or do we fail to do that? And then to create that. So from that, I created this sort of contrasting set of cities: the Las Vegas that plans, the Phoenix that doesn't. And that was really the beginning. But it was sort of this sense of umbrage, I guess, that got me going, just because, you're watching this guy say, we need to pray for rain. And you're like, we need to plan for a lot of this in the future. This is not going to get us where we need to go at all. And so, yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about your thinking as time has evolved since the book was published in 2015. I think for a while there, you sort of thought you were Cassandra and you'd overplayed your hand. But in recent years, with these reservoirs now below 30%, all of a sudden, your book is looking a little more to the point, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, one of the problems, when you're working with really abstract information, sort of data predictions, these kinds of things, and then trying to imagine some sort of instantiated future from that and saying, this is the future, this is the world we're approaching. It feels like you're always you're trying to do two things at once. You're sort of like trying to say like, okay, I think I'm seeing some things, but you're also trying to protect yourself from other people saying, come on, that's not really very realistic, is it now? And you're kind of going back and forth between those, sort of trying to extrapolate as seriously as you can while also trying not to seem outrageous. And there was a point when I published the book where I did sort of feel outrageous for a couple of reasons. One of them was that right as the book was coming out, California ended up having an incredibly wet winter. And so suddenly they were flush with water. And so it felt like, as any natural human being does, we respond to the most immediate stimuli. And so as soon as you feel like there's water in the air, as soon as you see there's water falling, as soon as you sort of experience that, the drought that you were just in and that felt so apocalyptic, it feels like it's been erased. And so we can respond to those simple signals in simple ways. And so right after I felt sort of foolish to be, I'm like, maybe the climate data, maybe it's going to be another 50 years before stuff matters. Maybe it's going to be 100 years. I don't know. Like, we know it's coming, but tomorrow, 50 years from now, make a guess. So part of it was that. Part of it was also that right at that moment, the Obama administration had gotten us into the Paris Climate Accords. And so it looked like the United States was actually turning a corner where it seemed like the US was really going to start seriously engaging with the idea of climate change. And it seemed like, we were finally putting to bed all of the cynically generated doubt around climate change theories. And so I was suddenly feeling like, oh, maybe this is like, we took the off ramp to sanity instead of, just barreling right over the cliff of stupidity. And so, yeah, there was a part of me that felt really foolish. And then we elected Trump, and he put people like Rick Perry, who pray for rain, into the energy department. And you're like, oh, okay, I guess we're getting back onto the path to stupid here. We're going to we're going to keep pretending like climate change doesn't exist. Got it. Okay. And, and then you feel sad because what you really would prefer is to feel stupid and wrong as opposed to more and more right. But yeah, like it's really interesting to sort of see, my perspective on that book sort of, goes up and down sort of in this funny way, depending on, what news story I've read in the last day and whether or not it seems to reinforce it or whether it seems to undermine it. And, predicting the future is always tricky. It's why, responsible scientists don't. I mean, and it's what, it's why I feel like it's kind of my job as a fiction writer is to extrapolate and is to make guesses and is to make, give you a picture of a future that may or may not exist, but seems at least likely.
I would just chip in here and say, I think many climate scientists have actually been surprised at how fast things have changed since the year 2010. I wrote the water sector chapter of the 2009 National Climate Assessment. And at that point in time, many things still felt theoretical. And, flash forward 13 years and all of a sudden it's like, this is for real. Lots of bad things are happening. They're going to get worse. And this whole last decade plus, I've had 4 fires near my house.
Yeah.
I've had 17 inches of rain here in 4 days, our annual total in 4 days, and almost completely flooded out of my house, $2 billion worth of damage in the Front Range. So, it's happening everywhere and very serious. And, while your book is a little out there, it provides good things to think about.
I mean, it's interesting because we all have this sense that there's a cliff out there and it's like we're all in the dark, sort of sticking our toes further and further along, trying to figure out exactly where that cliff is. And it does feel like, oh, suddenly, like by the time you figured out where the cliff is, you're actually over it. And that's the big worry.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about the research you did for this. And in your acknowledgments, you mentioned a bunch of really well-known and highly regarded journalists, Michelle Niehaus, Charles Fishman, Matt Jenkins, Laura Paskus, Jonathan Thompson, whose book this group is going to read later this year, John Fleck, and some others. Clearly, and your work at High Country News too, I'm sure set you up for doing this, but I'm kind of curious about some of your craft and your research. And it's pretty clear, you went deep into knowing sort of how the Colorado River ticks, and I tip my hat to you for that.
Thanks. Excellent. I fooled you then. No, it's so, some of this comes from there's 2 kinds of research that you do as a novelist. And one of those is just as you're going through your regular life, you're always accreting information. And so, right from, and then eventually you're finding ways to put it all together. And then there's that other stage where you're saying, I'm going to work on this particular book. And now I'm going to dive deep into what the heck is the Central Arizona Project and where does it go? And, how does it work? And where are the pumping stations? And, all that kind of stuff. I'm immensely grateful for all of these journalists and scientists who I get to sort of stand on the shoulders of and who I get to steal from, because, they're going out and doing this work day after day and, just sort of like documenting and digging and, because I worked at High Country News, I ended up with so many friends who, do this work. And so it's given me this opportunity to sort of research without even needing to research in many cases, because you get to sit around and drink beers with people and you talk about whatever they're doing that day and you talk about what they've been digging into lately. And, all of that ends up being part of the picture. The other, so that's part of it, is just having, when you have the right circle of friends, it's amazing how much material sort of flows to you organically. So that's part of it. Part of it is actually, so where I grew up is a farming and ranching area, and my family has land that's fed by an irrigation canal that comes from one of the Bureau of Reclamation projects, the Paonia Reservoir. It has relatively low-ranking water rights, fairly junior water rights, and I grew up in a place where you actually see what happens when there's a call on the river, and you see, normally the Fire Mountain Canal runs until September on a good year. And there was a call this year and now it's been shut off in July. And there's still water in the river. It's just not yours anymore. And that's pretty powerful stuff. And so there's some things about growing up where I did and where I moved back here eventually and still live here now, is that you get to see, just on a day-to-day level, you get to see, oh, Fire Mountain Canal has junior water rights. Farmer's Ditch has senior water rights. Farmer's Ditch runs all year long. It never gets cut off. You see dynamics like that, and you see who the winners and losers are just in your local area. Oh, these people, you can never actually farm, deeper into July than, if you're over on, Minnesota Creek Ditch or something like that. And those details like filter in, but also you see things like you get to watch the mountains covered with snow, and you get to watch them melt, and you watch the Paonia Reservoir fill, and you watch how it drains. And so you're watching these dynamics all the time anyway, and that's part of your growing up life. And I think it's sort of another piece of the sort of unconscious research that ends up informing a larger picture. And then there's this final stage, which is doing the actual book. And there were things where there was a point where I actually drove and went from city to city and town to town, all the way down the Colorado River, stopping at all the dams, stopping at all the intakes and stuff like that. Went and found the intake for in Lake Havasu, for where the Central Arizona Project pumps its water out. And there are a couple of guys fishing there. And I'm like, this is where the Central Arizona takes its, where Phoenix takes its water out. They're like, who are you? You're a loon. I'm like, no, this is really cool. It's like it's the most nondescript box, basically, with a couple of fences around it. And then driving across the desert and sort of cutting into the desert and finding this canal and following it and seeing how strange this piece of construction is. So there were things like that. There's stuff where you're trying to learn about the landscape and you're trying to learn about the biology of the different areas. And some of it goes in and some of it ends up just sort of sitting in the background, and, you never manage to slide it in, or you have to cut it from the story or whatever. But it's a strange process. It's like all sorts of different pieces, aggregated together.
And I think you said it took you well over 2 years from start to finish, right?
Yeah, I mean, because I started seriously working on the book in 2011 with the Texas drought. By 2012, I was going to water conferences in Colorado where we were having a drought there. I just kind of kept following droughts for a while, and then didn't fully complete the book until 2014, and then published in 2015. So yeah, it takes time.
So I wanted to give you an opportunity to read a section of the book, and I think you were going to do the part where Angel's driving into Phoenix.
Yeah. So this is a section. Angel has been sent down to Phoenix to investigate some water rights that might be available, and there might be something going on with water rights. And so he's been sent down to Phoenix by his boss, Catherine Case, who runs the Southern Nevada Water Authority. And he's just driving into Phoenix here. And so this is sort of a picture of Phoenix as it exists in the future. Campfires blazed in the darkness outside Angel's car windows, Phoenix's first telltales, refugees and recycling operations dotting the city's dark zone. The city consuming itself, whittling away the fat of more prosperous times. Ahead, taillight glows of thickening traffic, cheap electric scooters weaving between the black shapes of flex fuel pickups and Tesla machete SUVs, shadow shapes in the boiling dust of the interstate. Ghost images, a woman clutching the back of a scooter, whipped by wind, arms around her man's waist, her eyes and mouth pursed tight against the dust. Another scooter, hauling a 5-gallon water cube strapped down by bungee cords, the driver hunched over his handlebars, a bright blue filter mask hiding his features. More traffic, more life, heads and faces shrouded by scarves and masks against the dust and the smoke of California wildfires. Headlight beams, tunnels of light in the haze. People all along the roadsides, shoveling out from another storm, sweeping off cars, digging out of the dust, shadow ants working furiously. The pavement turned bumpy. Angel slowed, easing the low-slung car over washboard. Dustfall layers, one upon the next, upon the next. Inside the Tesla, cool AC pumped in a steady hiss through HEPA filters. Angel felt cocooned from the world outside. Red and blue glows on the instrument panels, soft chatter on the radio. KFYI call in. You know what this is really like? Pompeii. By the time it's over, we're going to be covered in dust, 50 feet thick. Right. Next caller. Angel's headlights illuminated a figure standing between the highway margins, head encased in goggles and filter mask, eyes flashing like an insect's as high beams swept over. A mute monster, inexplicable, then lost in darkness. I say we send our troops up to Colorado. I mean, that's our water they're holding. We should go up there and open the dams and get our damn water down here. The dark zone ended. 1 minute, Phoenix was dead and black. The next, the city was alive and blazing with neon and activity, as if someone had gone around the edges of the city, burning and blackening its rim with blowtorches, leaving nothing but the neon smoldering core, a living city, thrusting upward from the ashes of suburbs. If we weren't wasting so much water on farming, we'd all be fine. Cut the rest of the farms off. I don't care how senior their rights are. They're the ones wasting it. Hey, about what that last idiot said. If you cut off farms, you got dust storms. It's simple as that. Where the hell does he think all this dust is coming from? Zoners pointing fingers at one another, none of them pointing them back at themselves. Catherine Case said it was how you could tell someone was from Arizona. They never owned their problems. She liked that about them. It made them easy to gut. The Hohokam are right underneath us. We're walking on their graves. They ran out of water too. Look at them now, gone. You know what Hohokam means? All used up. In another 100 years, people won't even remember us. They won't even remember what Phoenix was. More lights, traffic jams, bars and gun stores, party girls on street corners, Texas refugees looking for someone to take them in. Street sweeping machines, sucking up the dust, carrying it off to God knew where. Private security and black riot gear standing outside a club. Car dealerships, mini malls, city-sponsored Johnny trucks ferrying piss and shit into the remaining water treatment plants, trying to keep disease down with functioning sewer lines gone. Above it all, a billboard blazed with the Phoenix Development Board's latest PR campaign. A picture of a fiery bird spreading its wings behind a collage of laughing children, solar fields, and the Taiyang arcology. Phoenix, rising. Right.
What fun. Thank you. Very evocative of the whole rest of the book. It's really fun to hear you read that. So let's talk about some of the characters. Oftentimes novelists come up with characters from people they know or important folks, and you've got Catherine Case, Queen of the Colorado, clearly Pat Mulroy-like figure. Angel, Lucy Monroe, the journalist, Maria Villarosa, the refugee from Texas. What do you want to share with us about where they came from and the fun you had in creating them?
So the way that I work a lot of times, especially when I'm working on stories where I'm trying to illustrate a concept as well as tell a story, is that I'm looking to sort of boil down from a big picture concept, something like, okay, I want to talk about climate change. That's too big. How do I deal with climate change? Okay, let's pick a region. Okay, now we've chosen a region. This region has water issues. Okay, now we're going to boil down even more. Okay, we're going to talk about the Colorado River Basin. We're going to talk about Phoenix. We're going to talk about Las Vegas. Okay, now we're going to boil down more. I still want to talk about water. How do we get into a lived experience of drought and climate change in this future? And who is going to help me find a path through? And so from that, then you end up with someone like Angel Velasquez, who's this water knife for Las Vegas, cutting water for Catherine Case. And he's going to be sort of my action character. He's going to be the guy who keeps this story moving and makes it a mystery thriller. But I also want to have an overarching perspective on this world. And so if I introduce a journalist like Lucy Monroe, who's based down in Phoenix, she's been documenting the collapse of Phoenix, watching it as it's fallen apart, as they failed the plan, as she's made friends and lost them, and as she continues to sort of hang on and keep observing what's happening to this city. She becomes a character who can both interview people, who can talk about her own experiences, who can provide an intellectual framework for understanding everything that's going on. So she's somebody I want to have in the story. And then there's someone like Maria Villarosa. and she's a refugee. She's one of the climate losers in the story. And you want to have the opportunity to see, what does it mean to lose everything? And what does it mean to be driven out of Texas by drought and then arrive in another place that's also falling apart, and be part of the sort of the domino of collapses that's going on as our systems start to fail. And so spending time with Maria, who's lost her father, she's trapped in Phoenix. All of the states have started putting up blockades against refugees because they don't want to be overwhelmed. So she's trapped in Phoenix, can't get to California, can't get further north to some other place with water. And she's going to give you a human access point to understanding what it is to lose, and hopefully create a universal access point for all of us to understand how vulnerable we are. So that's part of it. As far as, and then there is this point where you do start basing things on people. So Lucy is based on journalists I know. She's sort of an amalgamation of some journalists I know and love and respect. And so, like, it's this opportunity to sort of write your friend into the story. Catherine Case is without question sort of Patricia Mulroy 4.0. If you gave Pat Mulroy all of the power plus a military and some other solutions, she'd solve problems like Catherine Case, maybe. And I've actually been a huge fan of Pat Mulroy for years. She struck me as being one of the very few people who was really directly willing to engage with the scarcity and the vulnerability of Las Vegas and Nevada's water systems. And I think that partly came from the fact that she was always working with less water than everyone else was. And yet, like, I think there's something about her that was really brilliant because she is probably she just doesn't bullshit. And I've been fascinated by her for years, and High Country News interviewed her a couple of different times. She's just incredibly smart, and if you talk to her now, she still has incredibly strong opinions about how much needs to be done in order to make desert cities and these desert communities actually resilient. And she's far more aggressive and specific and clear about saying what needs to be done and how much we have to deal with still and how much we have to invest in order to become resilient. And mostly you see other politicians and other kinds of water managers backing away from those absolute statements. And I think she's been spot on all along. And so, yeah, so when I was writing Catherine Case, there was definitely a bit of a hat tip to someone like Pat Mulroy, who's did so much well when she was for her tenure with Southern Nevada Water Authority.
So tell us how you immortalize Rick Perry, and not in a good way, in the book.
So I created a cult called the Mary Perrys, and they basically spend all their time running around and praying for rain. And so they're very much a revival tent sort of apocalypse cult. And they're just convinced that if they just do the right things, God will love them again and the rain will start falling. And they sort of crop up everywhere. They show up in in refugee areas and stuff like that, trying to convert people. They're sort of always present, and they're sort of the ultimate denialists. Even as their entire world is collapsing, the only thing that they're thinking about, instead of actually functional interventions to solve the problems, they're still focused on sort of praying for rain and wishing it would just not be the way it is. And I really wanted to stick it to him after seeing the way he was talking about something that was so serious back in 2011. It was like, this is not the model. Like, if you have a politician who can't engage with reality, that's going to lead an entire society to ruin. And so, yeah, I wanted to poke pretty directly at him.
We're getting a little short on time, but I wanted to also thank you for including the Pima Indians in the storyline. And I don't want to give away the end, but Native American water rights are an important part of the story. And the Pima Indians had their water stolen in Phoenix, and they play a really important role. And I want to thank you and just offer an opportunity to comment on that without giving away the storyline.
I mean, the thing that was in my mind was, yeah, there's this long history of sort of water theft and water unfairness that goes back, 100 years more. And when you're talking about water rights, and when everybody is obsessed, this came up when I first wrote the Tamarisk Hunter years ago. Was it published in High Country News, which is a nonfiction newspaper, and it was a short story. And there was a great deal of interesting argument that started up after I wrote that short story, because it was all about who has the senior rights and who wins and who loses. And as it emerged, you started seeing that like nobody really had a really strong sense of like exactly what absolute shortages would do to all of the junior and senior rights, and how they all stacked up, and where the layers were of different water obligations and stuff. And so then you go back to this one larger idea of like who has senior rights. And when you start thinking about the Native Americans who were here first, it seems relevant. So, yeah.
All right, so I wanted to end with one final question for you that's more of a kind of an action question. And this talk is part of what's called Water 2022, this statewide effort to help Coloradans understand the risk to our water and motivate them to take actions as water stewards, and recognize the importance for their own welfare here in Colorado, because we're a headwater state, and we have a responsibility for downstream states. Mm-hmm. And so what is your message today to everyday Coloradoans about the role we each have to play in solving our water problems and our climate problems?
We have to do a much better job of becoming involved in the public workings of our society. It's not, you can say, yeah, you should conserve water. Yeah, you should install some solar panels. Yeah, you should drive an electric car or an electric bike, or something else, reduce the amount of carbon you're putting into the atmosphere. Those are all those nice, sort of personal responsibility things. But broadly, we're dealing with massive systemic problems. And so what we need is people involved in local government, in town government, in your local water boards. You need people involved at every level, and you need to get involved, and you need to start becoming an engaged member of these groups, because decisions are getting made all the time about how much are we investing in water? How much are we investing in our infrastructure? How much are we investing in storage? And some of this is going to be speaking specifically about resiliency. How do we plan, and how do we make sure that we're resilient enough for the future? And then also, how do we reduce the amount of risk that we engage with because of climate change? And all of those things, we have to start putting actual pressure into our governmental systems. And so that means we need to make our cities less car friendly. And that means we need to be involved in our cities to make them less car friendly, so people will use their bikes more, their e-bikes more, so that we can lower our carbon footprints, things like that. We need to have people looking really seriously at creating things like Las Vegas has done, where you put out water bounties for your for lawns, and you pay people to rip those out. We need them to go. We can't be watering grass. There's things like that. And again, but the first step on all of this is actual civic involvement. I feel like we're at a crisis point where civic involvement is something that we as an atomized nation don't really do very well. We move a lot, we travel, we don't necessarily set down roots tightly, we don't necessarily know our neighbors. And that makes us sort of anemic when it comes to dealing with big, complex problems. And so, getting involved in figuring out, where does my water come from? Have you ever been to a water board meeting? Have you ever even seen, where that is? If if you belong to a rural electric co-op, have you ever been to a rural electric co-op meeting? How is your, if you don't know how your electric co-op is deciding to source their electricity, you don't really know what's happening and how that's going to affect your future, your children's future, water supplies, all sorts of stuff. And it's all intermixed. I mean, that's the other complicated and hairy thing, is that, everything from the way that we decide to do urban planning, if we decide to do urban sprawl into, wildland interfaces, we're going to have more problems than if we decide to build for density and we permit for density. If we decide to sprawl, we're going to have commuter problems, which are going to use more energy, and that's going to affect climate change, and it's going to cycle back on us again. So at every level, whether you're talking about planning boards, you're talking about water boards, you're talking about energy boards, we need to be more involved.
I love it. And yeah, I would underscore all those messages personally. I would tell people, if you want to do stuff to reduce your carbon footprint, by all means do. Oftentimes you influence your neighbors.
Yeah.
Good discussion point. But if you
No, I
don't have
love my
the,
solar panels. I love that I put them on. I love that, like, you know, it's a good thing. I'm glad
but
I
if you
did it.
don't,
But like,
if you don't have the resources to do that, don't feel bad about it. Ultimately, this requires communal action to solve. It requires government, the whole of us to act together. We cannot do this individually. We will fail. And in fact, the people who are most guilty of this, that's exactly what they want us to think, that it's our own personal responsibility. And that doesn't work. That will not solve this problem. So I completely concur with you. And as a family who's been actively engaged in American politics for 80 years, I love it. All right, so let's move to some questions from our audience. Here's a question from Alex. Were the arcologies inspired or informed by Paolo Soleri's Desert City Arcosante, which I believe sits between Phoenix and Flagstaff on the interstate there?
Yeah, a little bit. I actually, Paolo Soleri, the first time I found out about Paolo Soleri was that I saw somebody with a t-shirt and it had Paolo on it. And I was like, oh, there's another Paolo out there. I was very excited. It's a common name, common as dirt in Italy, but not so much here. So that was the first awareness I had of Paolo Soleri when I was like 6 years old or something like that. And but yeah, stuff like Arcosanti. I was also really inspired by it's a biologist named John Todd who built things called living machines. He was really interested in how you could use biology to solve problems of water quality or cleaning, things like that, where you could create long cascading water systems, which would clean water, produce food, you know, feed fish, do all sorts of, you know, improve wildland health, whatever the thing was. And that by stacking the right living organisms together, that you could create positive outcomes. And so some of that is also inside of my thinking when I was thinking about the arcologies is, oh yeah, you should have, like, you know, your sewage treatment should be going through and creating koi ponds. It should be going through and going into hydroponic systems. And it should be, you know, there should be like a whole sequence of follow-on benefits built around sort of well-designed biomes. So yeah, both of those things.
So here's a question from CV. In the water knife, there were references to cartel states in Mexico. That left me very curious to see how you imagine South America in that universe. What would it look like?
So I was only thinking about, yeah, like, so what part of when I was working on the story, one of the things I was really interested in was what a society that's falling apart looks like. And so I was reading a lot about Ciudad Juarez. And I was reading a bunch of books about right after the murders in Ciudad Juarez started really kicking off, like the narco violence was really kicking off, and how that place kind of fell apart. And I used a lot of material from that. I was reading a lot of Charles Bowden books and things like that. And that influenced how I was thinking about Phoenix and what Phoenix, as it starts to sort of unravel at the civic level, would look like. And I think because of that, I started thinking also in terms of like where money and power sort of aggregate. And so I started thinking about the cartel states as far in Mexico. But as far as like going further south, I didn't really dig into that a whole lot. My assumptions are like, I mean, again and again, you have to look at like specific local regions, specific local culture, and then specific local pressures. And those are going to kind of define whether or how different places adapt. So, you know, one of the things I'd be interested in would be someplace like Brazil, where presumably the rainforest would continue to burn faster and faster as it gets hotter and drier, and as like there's more and more clear cutting, things like that. And so, you know, I might be looking at something like that. If I was looking down at the tip of South America, you'd be looking at like, how does snowfall affect, how is snowfall down in Argentina different than it is now? And how would that affect the states and the ranches and things like that? And, you know, so like, it's sort of like you kind of move from spot to spot, kind of like looking and seeing like, okay, does this seem like a spot that would be flooded? Seem like a spot that would be, you know, sort of unsustainable because of temperatures? You know, are we talking about equatorial zones that become so hot that you get above a point where human beings can actually sustain themselves because they're just too hot and too humid. So that would be a question. Those I'm definitely interested in where the livability sort of threshold is for human beings. There's a certain point where we just cannot cool ourselves out of doors anymore, and that would either mean that those areas that are really hot and humid would have to become almost entirely indoor cultures. So things like that. Those would be the kinds of things that I would think about. Maybe that answers the question.
Yeah. And that temperature, if anybody wants to know, is 35 degrees C, wet bulb. Humans cannot cool themselves. Kim Stanley Robinson deals with it in Ministry for the Future. There are a whole number of scientific papers on places around the planet that become unlivable because we will hit those temperatures if we continue to do exactly what we're doing now, which is emit 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases every year. So another question here from Andrew. I wonder if you wrote this after 2016, would you still have written the denialists as a small fringe group?
Wow. It's really hard to say, actually. I mean, one of the things that ever since 2016, I've had actually a really hard time writing most of the science fictional stuff that I do, just because it feels like finally people are starting to wake up and be concerned in a different way. And so what I was finding when I was writing, I was working on another science fiction book after 2016. And what I found was that I was merely echoing this sort of the hysteria of my peers, my friends, the people I read, things like that. And I was no longer sort of like extrapolating or adding to anything in the conversation. And so I'm not sure that, if I wrote The Water Knife after 2016, if it would be anything other than sort of an inchoate scream. It just, like the way that it's become incredibly difficult for me to write science fiction about these topics now. In terms of like, I think that some things I would push harder. If I was going back, I would push harder on the whole states' rights devolving, the gutting of the federal systems and federal government. Those were already trends that were there, and they're present in The Water Knife. I think I would probably exacerbate those more and sort of show those more deeply, because that strikes me as being that was part of the reason why I started thinking about the states being able to set up their own border controls, to be able to sort of push back refugees and stuff, was the idea of an anemic federal government and much more strong and sort of populist driven state governments. And so all of those things I think I was accurate about, and I think I would push those harder, and maybe push the sort of the shattering of the civil compacts between the states. I would probably push that stuff harder, more than the denialist stuff necessarily.
You do have militias at the state borders preventing migration from one state to another. So it's not as if you didn't deal with that.
Yeah, no, I just go more.
So here's a question from I just scrolled here. Wait a second. Any thoughts? This is from Bob. Any thoughts about the Front Range dwellers who unknowingly are drinking from the Colorado River?
I mean, it's kind of a giggle, but more seriously, almost nobody knows where their water comes from. I mean, literally, if you're down in Phoenix, the Phoenix dweller doesn't know where their water comes from. They don't understand that it could have been snow that melted off of one of the mountains outside the back of my house. So it's really interesting. We don't tend to know which reservoir our water comes from. We don't tend to know which pipes it runs through. We don't know where it gets cleaned. We don't know, and that's the product of, the incredibly successful water systems that we've created. We've made that stuff invisible. Water departments have been good at doing what they're supposed to do, which is deliver water seamlessly. So, one of the things I think, and this is true, I think, with all of our sort of industrial society, is that we oftentimes don't know where the stuff that gives us our prosperity comes from. We don't know, where the materials that are mined to go into our iPhone come from. We don't know where our water comes from. We don't know which mountain is melting to give it to us. We don't know who works on it. We don't know who needs to be responsible. We only notice when these things break. One of the things that just happened recently for us is that our local water system had a break in the line because a backhoe dug through it, and And suddenly, you know, all of our neighbors, and we are all out there looking at a hole with a bunch of water pouring out of it and going, wait, this is a problem. And then it's like, wait, who do we call? And it turns out the guy who normally works on our stuff is out of town right now. And so he's not available. And then who else do you call? And you're all running around in circles. You're like, this wasn't a problem until it was a problem. And so, you know, I think, you know, I have a lot of empathy actually for that. You know, we just don't know. And so it's worth us, you know, going on a little bit of an explore. It was certainly fascinating for me to go and follow the entire hydrology of the Colorado River all the way down to where the pumps were taking water out of Lake Havasu and then taking it across the desert and sticking it into an intake, you know, an inlet for the aquifers under Phoenix. You know, those are, it's like, oh, I understand more about this water system now than most Phoenix residents do. And it was just like, you know, it wasn't impossible to do. It was like, look up on a couple of maps and go exploring. It's pretty interesting.
So Paolo, I want to give Jayla an opportunity here because she got cut off to talk about Water 2022. We're getting close here.
Yeah.
And so Jayla, if you would drop back on here, let's hear about Water 2022.
Awesome. Thank you, Brad. And I really apologize for losing my connection earlier, but the conversation has been fascinating. I wish we had another hour or two to pick both of your brains. Water 22, the book club, is an opportunity to, you know, it's an entry point for you all here on the line today to invite your friends and your neighbors into this conversation. I have a book club I've been part of for 10 years, and I've got my friends reading The Water Knife, and we're actually meeting tomorrow night to discuss. So really excited about just talking about these really real issues and just where you started to go with the conversation around the role that we each have to play, whatever agency we have, whatever we have influence over, whatever seat we're sitting in, you know, whether that's as, you know, an everyday consumer or a policymaker. You know, we recognize that this is a critical moment in time to avoid the fate of Angel and Lucy and all of the characters in The Water Knife. So we really implore you to connect up with the Water 22 campaign at water22.org. We have a list of 22 ways that you can care for Colorado water in 2022. And it starts with exactly what you said, Paolo, going to the source and finding out where your water comes from as the number one way to understand how your actions can make a difference. And you can take the pledge to commit to engaging in these actions. The Water 22 pledge is there on the site. We have Hillary Afshari as our campaign coordinator is popping those URLs into the chat, so you can find it easily. But check out the rest of our Water 22 Book Club books. There are 3 more selections. The next one up is The Emerald Mile by Kevin Fedarko, which is not fiction. This is a historical account of the fastest run through the Grand Canyon on whitewater during a flood year, but it also documents a really neat historical account of water development on the Colorado River that led to building Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And I heard Brad say, provided a statistic, I think it was yesterday, that Powell and Mead were 95% full in 1999 and are projected to be at 25% full at the end of this year. Those are our nation's 2 largest reservoirs, and we've lost nearly 40 million acre feet of water storage in that time. I missed getting to give my full introduction to Brad, but if he didn't fully introduce himself, he is a senior water and climate research scientist at Colorado State University, and he's published extensively on climate change and its impacts on the American Southwest. And I learned a fun fact about him just earlier today, that he is the great-great-grandson of John D. Lee, the founder of Lee's Ferry, which is the measuring point between the upper basin and the lower basin on the Colorado River. So has great significance for the basin's water management. So really great to have you here with us, Paul, leading this conversation. And Paolo, thank you so much. If you haven't read The Water Knife or you don't have your own copy, it is not too late to do so. I hope this intrigued you and piqued your interest in reading the book and just supporting our local booksellers. We really encourage you to pick up your copy at the Tattered Cover, our gracious host for tonight's event. So Adam, I think we'll again post that URL in the chat so you can easily find that. And I think that's all I have to say, but Brad, if you have any other kind of parting words for the group, would love to hear that from you.
Let me just say, Kevin Fedarko's book is great. I encourage you to read it. As an ex-Grand Canyon dory boatman, it rings true to my heart. There's also a lot of family history in there for me. It talks about my uncle Stuart Udall when he was Secretary of the Interior, my father Morris Udall, who was instrumental in the Central Arizona Project. Two things in Colorado sometimes I don't really like to point out, and some of their literally crazy ideas. This is not the highlight of Udall environmental legacy, some of what they were proposing back in the 1960s, but it's a really good account, and I encourage everybody to read it. I think we should probably stop here. There are two more questions, but it feels like we're running late. And Adam, it's kind of up to you.
Yeah, I think there's two questions that I accidentally skipped when I was putting them in the chat, and I just want to make sure we get to them. Paolo, if you have time for two questions real quick, I can ask them real quick. Because they're both important. How optimistic are you that systematic approaches will prevail given the history in the colonial US of reactionary faith-based responses? What's the function of art in guiding this cultural shift? And I can put that, because I feel like I butchered it. Let me put that in our chat.
That's a big one. So I feel like the function of art can be whatever an artist wants to be. I mean, I'm a big fan of art for entertainment's sake personally, but in this particular case, I was interested in trying to create meaningful context for things that are otherwise pretty abstract. And when we talk about climate change, or we talk about drought, or we talk about, oh yeah, that could be difficult, or that could be complicated, or whatever. I feel like my job as an artist was to try to create a visceral illustration of what might be, so that you can sort of live into a future. One of the things I think the art does well is it creates empathy. And you can read a book about somebody who's completely different from you, who's from a different culture, from a different race, from a different gender, whatever, and you can experience their life, and you can sort of live with them. You can live inside their skin. And I think that's incredibly powerful, to get a chance to live with somebody else who's utterly unlike you. With science fiction, that's an opportunity for you to live inside of the skin of a future version of yourself. And so for me, a lot of it is saying, okay, so what does this future look like? What does it feel like to be there? How do we experience that? Is this, what are the good things and bad things about this? But mostly, like, what is the physically, viscerally experienced life like? And then ideally, when you come back to your own body and you come back to your own world, and you close the book, that goes away. It's a fantasy, right? But then you read a fact like, oh, gee, Lake Powell is now at 30% capacity. And suddenly, hopefully, you have context for understanding why that might matter, because you've read a story about these lakes going dry, these reservoirs, these huge water storage systems going dry. If you hear Lake Mead is now below intake number 1, and Las Vegas is using their lowest number intake, that's a piece of information that was abstract, but hopefully, because of the story, now becomes meaningful, and it says, oh, actually, we're heading somewhere, and maybe I don't like this, and maybe it's time to do something. As far as like how optimistic I am that we can create systematic approaches, well, I mean, every time people organize to do things, we do really well. So that's kind of on us. What I've noticed is that a lot of times, the people who are most motivated are the people who drive the bus. So it's up to us to be motivated. And it's harder because we're talking about really abstract things that are really complicated. And so that takes a greater mental effort to say, yeah, I'm going to be unembarrassedly motivated about this thing called climate change that's sort of hard for people to understand completely, but I'm still going to be unembarrassedly motivated. So I think it's up to us.
Thank you. And I kept most of the questions I was giving Mark. They're all water related, but this last one that I want to end on, because I work for a bookstore, is more literary related about your writing. But again, I want to thank Jayla, Water Education Colorado, Brad Udall for moderating, Paolo for being here. The last question is, what is the role and significance of love affairs in all of your apocalyptic books?
I like love stories. I'm actually a big romance fan. even though a lot of the romances don't necessarily work out for the main characters in my stories, I'm actually a huge romance fan. I like romantic comedies. That's actually where I go for my own personal comfort and stuff like that. I was deeply invested in the first season of Bridgerton, things like that. But I think that, I think this comes down to storytelling also, though, is like that when your characters care about each other or they have deep connections with one another, it makes me more invested in them, and hopefully it makes readers more invested in those stories too. It's one of the key things that drives all human behavior, is the desire to be connected to other people, and so that's the main thing for me.
Definitely. We're all just looking for love and then a future climate that our
Right,
children could live in, right? Thank you, everyone who stayed a little longer than anticipated. Again, thank you, Jayla, Water Education Colorado, for making this happen. She earlier said it wasn't all her. It was all her. It was all Water Education Colorado. So thank you. Thank you for all you do for Colorado and the world. Paolo, thank you for writing amazing books. Mark, thank you for everything literally you and your family has done. Amazing. Thank you to all the viewers out there supporting independent bookstores. I'm going to say goodbye and good night. This was amazing. I loved every moment of it.
Thank you.
Not at all.
All right, good night, everyone.
It was fun.